Well, good morning, everybody. Barry Jones, SP History. And today we're hopefully going to conclude the Secret Service part of this Deep State series. And we've been looking, if you go all the way back to the original episodes of this series, trying to define what a treasonous cabal is, where it came from, where this deep state, some people think it's this amorphous blob that you can't really identify, but it's made up of people. And we've been going through a lot of different people that make up this deep state and where its origins stemmed from. We go all the way back to the end of the Civil War when the rise of the corporations, the private sector, began to dwarf the public sector in terms of money and power. And there's going to be a merging of the two, private and public, after the world wars, out of necessity during the wars, so the private sector could run the wartime economy. But then afterwards, it became mutually beneficial to both to sort of merge into one. And this is when the deep state really got dangerous. We've defined the deep state during this Cold War period, this era, as the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. As a private industry or a private sector phenomena, originally, ultra vires, which govern the private sector and these corporations, stipulated that private interests trumped public interest. They even had a firing mechanism built into their their business principles, whereby if any of the actors of the corporation, whether it be the CEO, the board, whomever, acted in the public interest and it hurt the private interest, i.e., the corporation, that person or those persons could be fired. In other words, they had a mechanism by which they could remove the offending party. I think that's really key when you see the two merge, private into public. That mechanism by which they removed the problem child, so to speak, remained intact. It wasn't just voting him out of office. It might involve assassination. The third part of ultravires and the business principles was that they always guaranteed themselves immunity afterwards, so they never faced any accountability. I have said this and said this and said this. If you understand ultravires and you understand the motive the deep state has continuing to this day to make money, and they have learned that making money comes through war, not peace. You understand how they control the levers of power, and thus they can create these wars out of thin air or keep wars going on and on and on in order to keep the money trough flowing. And you understand ultravires and how these two private and public sectors merge together, which means ultravires made it into the public sector. You pretty much understand government today. You understand that no one is looking out for the public interest. They're all looking out for whatever is maximizing the benefit to themselves and whatever that interest they represent. And if anyone steps out of line and works in the public interest, they work together. And you could say that with even with political parties, Democrats and Republicans work together because it's become a unit party where they all are engaged in the same game. So if someone or something comes along that exposes that game, they work together to expel that person or those persons by whatever means is necessary. And then they immunize themselves afterwards. They control the investigations, they control the legal system, they control law enforcement, they control the lawmaking bodies, plural. They control everything. So they get away with it time and time again. At some point, uh, this all rises to the level of treason. And we've defined treason as the betrayal of one's country, aiding and abetting the enemy. It could be overthrowing the government, could be overthrowing the king or killing the king. Any one of those definitions fits the criteria for treason. And when our government together with the private sector, saw a motive to propagandize Americans into foreign wars, starting with the Spanish-American War, continuing with World War One, continuing with World War Two, continuing through the Cold War, and all the proxy wars contained within, continuing to this day. Then, since it's not their kids who are fighting and dying, that is by definition treason. And when all this started, they were very treacherous in their behaviors towards the American people, the little people. They sicked the Pinkertons on folks who were trying to unionize their factories. They were very treacherous. They price gouged. They they hired and fired people willy nilly. Didn't take care of them in their workplace. It was very treacherous, unethical, and immoral the way these big corporate heads, these big corporate bodies treated the little people who worked the factories for them. But at some point, it crossed the line from treachery, immorality, unethical into treason. And that's where it's been ever since. And so we've been looking at how this all relates to the JFK assassination, because it's my contention that though he wasn't the first, FDR proved a little bit problematic to this deep state. They tried very hard to overthrow him, the deep state plot from within his own government to overthrow him. It didn't work, it didn't succeed, but it's oftentimes is how it works. You try again. You fail forward. You learn your lessons from the first failure, first attempt, and next time you do it better. By the time we get to JFK, the deep state has run into somebody who is standing up to them time and time again. I did a whole series of videos on JFK and him standing up to the steel industry. That's a big industry. And of course, it's very involved in the national security apparatus. And he stood up to them, made some enemies. He stood up to the war lobby that wanted at first a war in Laos. He said no. And then a war in Cuba, he said no. And in a war in Vietnam, he was in the process of saying no yet again. And a lot of these deep staters came from the South and were very offended by his civil rights stances. And yet he was becoming a civil rights champion. And he was offending big business such as big oil, trying to take away their oil depletion allowance and trying to pass the Kennedy Act and tax their profits that they hide in offshore bank accounts. He was offending the military that they thought he was soft on communism. All of his interactions with Khrushchev, in their view, Khrushchev came out ahead. He was trying to negotiate a peaceful end to the Cold War. He was trying to make nice with Fidel Castro and Khrushchev. He was trying to end the space race between us and the Soviets and launch into a period of cooperation between us and the Soviets. I mean, the list is just endless. And of course, if he stayed in power, maybe just one more week, LBJ was toast. And so so you start looking at all the motives of these players. Then you get to the Secret Service. We haven't got into the motive yet. We will today. But we've been looking at its participation as a conspirator in this plot. And we've so far answered 5 questions. The first question was, did the Secret Service have prior warning that a Dallas could happen? And it's clearly they did. The second question was, in order to corrupt the Secret Service, do you have to corrupt the entire agency? I gave you 4 names of rogue operators that once you corrupt the top, everybody else falls in line, obeys orders. The third question had to do with security breakdowns. Do they rise to the level when taken together to be security stripping? One is unintentional, the other is intentional. One implies foreknowledge of a crime. The other implies a lack of that foreknowledge. In other words, was the Secret Service engaged in a process to strip away? When you take all those security so-called breakdowns into consideration, it's become obvious that the Secret Service was engaged in their part of the plot to strip away all of JFK's security so that he was uh, exposed on Dealey Plaza. And and is there any indication that they knew that if they, for example, released their internal documents, that it would be obvious to anyone with half a brain that they had security stripped in Dallas? So as uh, to justify why they never released those documents, they want anybody to see the difference, compare and contrast the differences between Dallas and all the previous JFK motorcades. So that was question 4. Question 5, or that was actually question 3. Question 4 was, were there any examples of the Secret Service tried to suppress evidence afterwards, after the shooting? And I gave you multiple examples, up to including this very day when they still won't release documents. And in question 5, we got into the story of Abraham Bolden. My question was, though we can't get information internally from Secret Service documents about their complicity, is there any other source of internal evidence from within the Secret Service we can rely on to indicate that the Secret Service was involved in this plot? And of course, that's the story of Abraham Bolden. And folded in within the way they treated Abraham Bolden is prior uh, Secret Service agents who had foreknowledge and refused to play along with the plot. The stories of Thomas Shipman and Chuck Robertson. So when you understand those two stories, the Abraham Bolden story makes complete sense. It's just that's the third Secret Service agent we've talked about so far that paid a very, very steep price. 2 of them died. There was too much light on Abraham Bolden, but they tried everything to ruin his life as well. Why? Because he was an honest broker and he saw things that he could report, he was willing to report, that would have indicated the Secret Service was compromised on that day. They just weren't going to let that happen. Remember, these deep state operators understand how to immunize themselves, how to discredit their enemies, how to take out their enemies, dispose of their enemies, and how to rig investigations so they come out lily white and the patsies end up carrying the brunt of everything. They understand very well immunity, the concept of immunity. Today, we're going to be looking at 2 questions. I'm going to try to fold 2 presentations into one because they're pretty short. Question 6 is, how would a conspiracy within the Secret Service even work? I mean, practically speaking. And then number 7 is, what is a limited hangout? That is a term that a lot of folks aren't familiar with and fall victim to. They fall prey to this intelligence strategy to deceive the American people. It's called a limited hangout. So we'll talk about that today. So those are the 2 questions we're looking at. One of my chief sources in the answering of this first question, how would a conspiracy even work, is Fletcher Prouty. I don't think he's with us anymore, but you listen to him on YouTube or you read his books, and this is a guy who understands the inner workings of this deep state better than most because he was inside it. He was the liaison between 2 very important deep state operators, the CIA and the Pentagon. And he was the guy who helped, when the CIA ran a black ops and they needed military backup, they went to Fletcher Prouty and he arranged all the military backup. So he had relationships with people on both sides, the CIA, the intelligence side, but also the military side. His boss was Ed Lansdale. If you remember the story, Ed Lansdale was the guy who sent him on vacation before Dallas so that he would not be able to arrange for the security on the ground that day, the 112th Military Intelligence Group out of Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. That was Fletcher Prouty's job. So when he was sent on vacation to literally the North Pole, somebody in his place, I don't know if it was Raleigh or Ben or Boring or Emery Rock, we don't know who it was, called Fort St. Houston and told the 112th to stand down. So this bottom picture is as it's shown in the movie JFK, and of course this uh, scene portrays Fletcher Prouty finding out while he's away in the North Pole. I think he's in Sweden at the time. Uh, what happened to Kennedy while he was gone? And he's thinking about it because he's putting pieces together in his mind. This in real time, since there's a time difference, this just happened. And yet I'm opening this paper and I have a full spread about the guy that they said did it. I mean, they have his military background. They have the fact that he went to Russia. They have everything. And it's almost like a cover story had been prepared in advance. And when it was ready, and when the moment was right, they dropped it on the American media and filled that vacuum that, I heard psychologists talk about this where they say we all have this. It's human nature. We have this uh, almost like this need to fill vacuums with something to help us make sense of the situation. So, for example, in the aftermath of the JFK assassination, there was all kinds of rumors running around. The Russians did it, the Cubans did it. Was it one shooter? Was it multiple shooters? Blah, blah, blah. And people tend to panic in situations like that when they don't have answers to the big questions. It's very stressful to our psyche, to our even our physical being. It's very stressful, and so what we draw comfort from is a story that makes sense. And the quicker that story appears, the quicker it hardens within the psyches and the minds of the people who read it, who take it in, and it becomes the accepted narrative. It's very difficult to unwind that afterwards. And so this is a part of what he was familiar with, psych warfare, whereby you create a situation that causes uncertainty. You create a situation that causes a little bit of panic, fear, doubt, uh, a desire for answers, for revenge, and then you yourself created that, and then you yourself have created for that moment a cover story to drop into that vacuum to answer all those questions. And they understand better than most, the intelligence agencies, how effective this psych warfare is. There's evident there's cases within the last 5 years where it's happened to us, where something major happened and we didn't have answers, and we were willing to trust the so-called experts who gave us the answers. Now we have found out since that all those answers were wrong. In fact, they were made up. They were intentionally wrong. But it demonstrates just how easily we can be fooled, how easily we can be lulled into a false narrative because in our minds it makes sense. And that's really all we care about, is making sense of a situation. So here he is trying to figure out the situation. And because he is from that world, understands what a cover story looks like. And everyone else is reading the same stories he is, but they don't have the experience he has. And so they're sopping it up. And he's not. He's putting pieces together, which is why when he returned home, he starts retracing the steps to find out, was the 112th Military Intelligence Group notified to be there on the ground in his absence? And he found out quite the contrary. They were told to stand down. Now that opened the door in his mind to understand that this was a plot. And he begins investigating it. You listen to, and of course, he has the advantage of knowing how they work. And with respect to the Secret Service, here's a couple books: The Secret Team, and this focuses on the CIA aspect of. Of course, he was a liaison to the CIA, so he understood that world very well. And then the second book is the how the uh, impact of the assassination of JFK changed foreign policy and led straight to uh, the Vietnam War, for example, how the two were tied together. And of course, it was a CIA war together with the Pentagon. So there's no one better situated to draw conclusions and see the outcomes of the assassination of JFK and how it affected the CIA and the military going forward and foreign policy in Vietnam going forward than Fletcher Prouty. No one's better situated to understand that. With respect to the Secret Service, famously, I've heard him say this several times. Uh, he says, "quote When you control," he's talking about the uh, the Praetorian Guard. That's what he always calls it, going back to ancient Rome. But he says, when you control the elite guard of a country, you control the fate of the king. And he believed that the elite guard, in this case, the Secret Service, uh, had motive to want to participate in the plot to kill JFK because they didn't like JFK and they much preferred the alternative, which was LBJ. And like I've been saying, and I drew some of my conclusions from him as a source, but he believed it wasn't the entire Secret Service. It was a rogue element within the Secret Service that played along. Everybody else just followed orders. So if you get a chance, check out some of his work or listen to him on YouTube. The man is a walking encyclopedia of uh, history knowledge, going all the way back to World War II, because he was on the front lines. Like for example, another thing I learned from Fletcher Prouty, just as an anecdote, is he was a pilot at the end of World War II, and he was one of the pilots responsible for transporting all the war materials that had been stored on those islands in preparation for an invasion of Japan. And it was his understanding that we would be shipping all that stuff back to the States afterwards because we didn't need it. There was no invasion of Japan, right? After we dropped the bombs, they surrendered. He says, no, we divided all of these war materials, which was just a huge stockpile. And he says we divided them in half, and we flew half of them to Korea, and the other half flew to Vietnam in preparation for the next two wars. My God, what an illuminating statement, a moment for me myself, just personally to understand that these deep state operators were already at the end of World War II planning the next two wars. We're so far behind them in terms of strategically looking into the future. The What Alan Dulles was doing was already, the secret surrender and operation. We've talked about this in other videos. The uh, Operation Paperclip, but before that, the operation to negotiate secret surrender with with the Italian fascists and the German fascists, the Nazis, basically, so as to protect all their uh, assets, these big corporate assets that they, as lawyers, had helped facilitate in the interwar period. Now they're at risk of being destroyed at the conclusion of World War II unless they can negotiate a quick secret surrender. Well, this caused great distrust between the Allies, United States, Britain, and Russia. Russia felt totally, you know, sandbagged by the whole thing, double crossed. And that set the stage for the Cold War. So you can just see how, while we're still fighting in World War II, we have deep state operators like Alan Dulles and his brother John Foster work, and James Angleton, all these future State Department, CIA people. Uh, they're already setting the stage for the new war, which is going to be between us, the Soviets, the Cold War. It's going to go on for 40 some years, and then contained within that Cold War, we're dividing up all the war materials, sending half to Korea and half to Vietnam in preparation for the next two proxy wars. And because they determined that war is very lucrative. So, getting a little bit off track here, but I learned that again from Fletcher Prouty. He's at least the one that opened my eyes to it. So let's talk about and answer this question. How would a conspiracy involving the Secret Service even work? And let's go to the rogue operators because that's the point I've been trying to make. You only have to contaminate or corrupt the rogue operators at the top. And of course, that starts with James Rowley, pictured here with LBJ. He's the guy who appointed the Dallas details, set up all the personnel, removed the experienced people, replaced them with inexperienced, took out the driver, uh, replaced the driver with his guy, who, and of course, the driver ends up playing a key role, replaces the guy in the second seat, and he ends up playing a key role, puts his guy, Emory Roberts, in charge on the ground, sends Thomas Kelly in so that after the shooting, he's there to clean up the mess. He's got uh, Thomas Kelly has his henchmen there to intimidate all the witnesses, seize evidence, etc., etc. It's all set up in advance, but it all starts with Raleigh. Um, he's the guy who acted on LBJ's instructions. Remember the phone call to the room where a dying Lee Harvey Oswald was lying, basically instructing the Secret Service never to leave his bedside. If he regains consciousness, get a deathbed confession out of him. In other words, we're going to be in control of what this guy, anything that comes out of his mouth, we're in control of it. And the way LBJ phrased it, according to the doctor who heard it, was get from him a final deathbed confession, which is like code for uh, if he does say anything, it's going to be the last thing he says. Even though he may regain consciousness, he's not going to live. His end has already been predetermined. And it was Raleigh who carried out those instructions on behalf of his friend LBJ. And then when the Warren Commission was investigating, it was Raleigh who covered up all the mistakes of the Secret Service to the extent that he could. Now, by the time we get to the House Select Committee in the late 70s, a lot of them had dribbled out. We had Abraham Bolden's story by then, for example. We had a lot of researchers who had found the evidence. But in 64, that process hadn't caught up with the investigative process. And so the investigative process, which was rushed, you know, was able to basically clear the Secret Service and just say, well, they had some deficiencies as far, because of inexperience, because of uh, incompetence, whatever. But as far as their culpability, they were immunized from any criminal wrongdoing. And it was because of James Raleigh. He's the one that testified. When they called in somebody to testify, it was Raleigh. And then subsequent, he never left LBJ's side during his entire presidency. So he declared his loyalty uh, by proximity, basically by never leaving the guy's side whom he protected. Remember the story during the motorcade? Secret Service left JFK wide open, never moved, never took any evasive action. Just took him into a kill zone between 5 rifles. And then after the first shot, when there was still 5.6 seconds for them to save his life, they didn't move. They didn't do a thing. They didn't lift a finger to help JFK. Meanwhile, they got agents all over the top of LBJ protecting him. Pretty clear where James Raleigh's loyalties uh, lay during that entire episode. So the second name you need to remember is Thomas Kelly. We've talked about him. He's the inspector who was on the ground in Dallas to clean up the loose ends afterwards. They knew, okay, there's no deep state operators could be more exposed initially than us because our only job is to protect the president. And everyone's going to intuitively say, well, where was the Secret Service during all this? What were they doing? That's the first question. So it was going to be very necessary to be there and begin confiscating film and photos, begin intimidating doctors and witnesses about the direction of the shots and entrance wounds versus exit wounds, and cleaning up the crime scene, or removing it entirely, the limo, kidnapping the body of the president, taking it back for a rigged autopsy. This is all handled by the Secret Service. And of course, it was Thomas Kelly who was in charge. Emory Roberts was in charge of the events on the ground as far as the motorcade was concerned. But as far as the after, uh, the what happened after that, the aftermath, Thomas Kelly's in charge. So just follow the flow chart. You start with Raleigh. He sends his man Kelly in. Kelly takes over. He's got his enforcer Elmer Moore running around, uh, acting as the sort of the heavy in this case, but he's carrying out the instructions of Thomas Kelly, who was carrying out the instructions of his boss, James Raleigh. Um, as we said, they removed JFK's body, they removed the limo. They even ordered JFK and Connolly's clothing to be sent to the cleaners and or destroyed, depending. Uh, so there's another piece of evidence. For example, you know, the president was shot in the back, and it became a matter of great discussion later of the Warren Commission. Gerald Ford was involved in this, where that shot hit him in the back. And they're trying to show, to make the magic bullet work, that that bullet that hit him in the back came out the front of his neck. Well, of course, if it hit him flush in the back, there's no way it came out the front of his neck. It was coming at a downward angle. It'd have to change direction, trajectory. So Ford just moved it up and said, well, it didn't hit him in the back. It hit him in the back of the neck. It came out the front of his neck. And because there was no clothing to compare it to, it had been destroyed. Certainly there was a shirt and a jacket that belonged to Kennedy with a bullet hole right in the back, which would help show definitively where that bullet hit him in the back. But it didn't fit the narrative. They needed one bullet to this magic bullet to do all these zigging and zagging up and down all around. And so the clothing was conveniently destroyed so they could move the location of the shot to the back to now becoming a shot in the back of the neck. They just move it up 6 inches or whatever. It's ridiculous. But this is why you don't get rid of evidence. But they did. And then, of course, Kelly ends up serving as the liaison to the Warren Commission. So Raleigh's being called in to testify to the Warren Commission. He's in full cover-up mode, but doing the day-to-day filtering of any incriminating evidence of the Secret Service being presented to the Warren Commission. Thomas Kelly was there to you know to launder it, basically to filter it out. He was the liaison, and he was sort of the on the ground, boots on the ground guy who represented James Raleigh in front of the Warren Commission. So there's two guys actually, and I wouldn't even necessarily include Elmer Moore. I don't tend to think that underlings who are useful instruments and carry out the instructions of their bosses, I sort of give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they knew, maybe they didn't. I don't really care because they're not the ones giving the orders. So I look at three in particular. I look at Raleigh, I look at Kelly, and of course he had his useful instrument, Elmer Moore, and I look at Emory Roberts. Emory Roberts was the guy on the ground in Dallas, and he did make some key decisions that turned out to be disastrous decisions as far as if you're JFK anyway. Kellerman technically was in charge of the trip, but Roberts was the agent running things, primarily because Ben and Boring weren't there. And underneath them now, instead of having all these experienced agents, you now have all these inexperienced agents. And so Roberts is running the show, and he got his way He wanted the destination of the motorcade to be the Trade Mart, not the Women's Museum. He wasn't the only one. Connolly wanted it. LBJ wanted it. Roberts, represented the Secret Service, wanted it. They got their way. The Kennedy people didn't get their way. You say, well, what does that matter? He was dead by the time the trademark never entered into the equation. It would have. If they hadn't got him at Dealey, they were going to get him at a trademark. He's the guy that waved Ripka and Lawton off the limo. Remember, they were supposed to be on the back of the limo on the running boards. And right at the beginning of the motorcade left field, he waved him off. That was an Emory Roberts decision. Um, he's the guy that removed Godfrey McHugh. As you can see, uh, there's no one in that middle. You see my cursor there. Godfrey McHugh usually sat. I'm sorry, this is the backup car. This is in the circle there. That's Emory Roberts. He's following along behind the limo, making all these decisions in real time as they proceed along. But one of his decisions was to remove from the front seat of the limo where JFK was riding Godfrey McHugh, opening up a field fire. That was Emory Roberts' decision. He removed the flatbed media truck, again, opening up the field of fire in the front. He ordered the 8 motorcycles gone, again, opening up the field of fire front and the side. And then acting on Bill Moyer's request, who was an LBJ aide, it was Emory Roberts who ordered uh, the Secret Service agent whose name I'm forgetting, but he's right here where I'm circling. He's the driver of the backup car, Sam Kinney. He ordered Sam Kinney to remove the bubble top, put it in the trunk. So, yeah, and some more decisions Emory Roberts was involved in. He worked with the Dallas mayor, changed the motorcade route. If you can't bring the shooters to the target, bring the target to the shooters. So they did. And of course, you have to slow it down. So you put in these 90-degree turns. We found out later he's the guy that ordered the 112th Military Intelligence Group to stand down, right? So uh, the guy who was really interested in finding out who gave that order was Fletcher Prouty. He discovered who it was. And then when the shooting started, and all these guys in the back of cars supposed to spring into action, they all just sat there. And when questioned about it later, they said all of them, in similar testimony, they had been ordered to stand down, and he just kept ordering it over the radio: stand down, stand down, stand down. The only guy who disobeyed was Clint Hill, who jumped off the running board, ran up to help Jackie. So these were all decisions made by Emory Roberts. Then, when you get to Parkland, uh, Roberts came around and looked at Kennedy, who's still lying in the back seat, took one look at him, after, first of all, ordering Jackie to get off of him. He just gruffly said, "Get off him. He's dead. I'm going with Lyndon." And from that moment on, he left the side of JFK and he went to Lyndon Baines Johnson. And then when it starts to leak out about the Secret Service partying the night before with booze and women and drugs, etc., then they lost their badges, they lost their guns. All this starts to leak out when the Warren Commission asks him during his period when he's testifying. He covers it up. He tries to cover it up and minimize it. And then after LBJ assumed office, Roberts, just like his boss Raleigh, became LBJ's personal bodyguard, escorting him around from place to place, never left his side. Roberts becomes LBJ's personal secretary. And that's kind of interesting. LBJ was asked once why Emory Roberts was not on his protective detail anymore, like he was on JFK's protective detail. And LBJ's answer implied he didn't trust him, couldn't trust him to protect JFK. Why would I trust him to protect me? Even though they were on the same side of this, they still didn't trust him. If you can corrupt a guy once, you can corrupt him again. So he made him his personal secretary instead. But so here you see, whoops, these are the 3 rogue operators, I believe, made the Secret Service made it possible for the Secret Service to participate in this conspiracy. You just get those three people at the top, and all the decisions flow from them. So you got these three stooges, if you want to refer to them that way, that are loyal to LBJ. They're not loyal to JFK at all. Raleigh is friends with LBJ, and of course LBJ can't stand Kennedy. So by extension, neither can Raleigh. And and then Kelly and Roberts are loyal to Raleigh. So they're going to do whatever he wants. And they all were intimately aware of JFK's reckless behavior when it came to drugs. You know, look up sometime if you get a chance. Look up. They call him Doctor Feelgood. You know, he was JFK's doctor, and all of the basically the amphetamines, the methamphetamines that he was putting together and these potions and stuff to help treat JFK because he had terrible pain. He had Addison's disease. He had all these back issues. Uh, he was in terrible pain all the time. So to alleviate the pain, which I certainly understand, uh, he's trying to help. And JFK was in terrible pain. Here he is, the president. But we now know the harmful effects of methamphetamines. And here, our president, JFK, was basically hopped up on meth as a result of this Dr. Feelgood. And the Secret Service was aware of it. And of course, it didn't just stop with, it wasn't just a treatment for pain, it became a pleasure thing as well. There's a big, he had one of his girlfriends, I'm trying to remember her name, um, Mary Pinchot, Mary Pinchot Meyer, whom he had a long running affair with. I think it was her. Anyway, they did drugs together, right? And she had a relationship with Timothy Leary, that drugged out guy out in Boston somewhere. And she was trying to get him to, well, it's a long story. And it was very, very reckless. Okay. Even the most ardent JFK defender can't deny the fact that JFK was experimenting through his doctor, but oftentimes for his own personal enjoyment because he felt so good as a result of these drugs. It became a pleasure thing as well, and he was ripe for all kinds of blackmail because of the people he was involved with who were in that same drugged up circle. So Secret Service was aware of all this, and then his sexual escapades are just legendary, and reckless. And again, ripe for blackmail because it turns out some of them, one of them was the shared girlfriend with Sam Giancana. He's a mobster. Another was an East German spy who was sent over here as like a honeypot, and he's sleeping with her as well. He could not say no to a pretty woman. It didn't matter if she was married. It didn't even matter if she was the wife of one of his best friends. He just could not or would not say no. He was his daddy's son, no question. And of course, Secret Service knew about all this. And here he is posing as a family man, you know. And the juxtaposition between him and LBJ, in their view, was pretty stark. And not just the Secret Service, but the military, the CIA, the national security apparatus viewed LBJ as a cold warrior, one of them, and JFK was one of these liberals, these pinko soft on communism types. So they thought he was a national security risk. And then you throw in the civil rights issue. I already told you the Secret Service was mostly good old boys from the South, white. And they didn't like this civil rights crusader in the White House. So this is another thing to add to the long list of motives the Secret Service had to participate in this plot. They thought there was a moral degenerate who was a national security risk, who was trying to fundamentally change the culture of our country, the civil rights stuff. Uh, they thought it was the patriotic thing to do to get rid of him. They bought into this idea that they were the patriots saving the country from guys like JFK. And if they didn't, you might have RFK and Teddy afterwards. We might wake up one day and have lost the Cold War because three consecutive Kennedys sold our country down the river. That's their view of it. So I've always thought this picture down, these two pictures show kind of this suspicious uh, view towards Kennedy by all the people in the LBJ orbit. And you really get back down to it. Everybody we've discussed so far is solidly in the LBJ orbit. The CIA, the Pentagon, all the oil people, the Secret Service, the FBI. I mean, these are all his friends. So everyone is on LBJ's side, ganging up on JFK. So those are the motives, as I see it, for the Secret Service. Those are the three rogue operators, and those are the motives. Now let's look at the payoffs to these folks in the Secret Service once JFK is out of the picture. First of all, this moral degenerate is no longer president. That's a net positive, right? As far as they're concerned. The communist sympathizer is no longer president. So from a national security standpoint, we're coming out ahead. The civil rights crusader is no longer president, even though, interestingly, LBJ got the civil rights bill passed in 64. By the way, that was pure politics. That was LBJ saying, we're going to get African Americans voting Democrat for the next 100 years. We get this passed. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Their guy is now the new president. Raleigh becomes his personal protector. Kelly serves as the liaison to the Warren Commission, and Roberts ends up as LBJ's personal secretary. So not only are they immune from any sort of prosecution or any kind of blowback, they profit from it. And in their view, the country's better off. So they're protected. It's ultra vires all over again. The guy who was not acting in the interests of their interests is fired. In this case, he's killed. He's removed. And the folks who were behind this treason got away with it because they arranged the immunity in advance, because they had relationships with all the right people who could protect them. So the payoff was certainly worth it as far as they're concerned. Back to Fletcher Prouty, who says the elite guard will protect the life of the king, quote, as long as it agrees with the king. This is where motive comes in. And I got that picture here, Julius Caesar being taken out by senators, honorable men, right? Even his friend, Brutus, who at some point decide that their disagreements trump their agreements or their relationship with Caesar. And because of that, he is an interest that his interests don't align with theirs. So he is an obstacle to their interests. He has to be taken out. It's exactly what happened to JFK. And you know, the Romans invented the Praetorian Guard, right? That's where the name comes from. It was the equivalent of our Secret Service. And you wonder, well, where was this Praetorian Guard when these senators are stabbing Julius Caesar to death? Well, I would argue that was the first case of security stripping, leaving him wide open to the conspirators to carry out their plot. Same thing happened in Dallas. The Secret Service had been so sufficiently stripped of all of its security protocols prior to the motorcade arriving in Dealey Plaza that by the time it got there, uh, JFK had no one looking out for him, no one protecting him. And he was surrounded by all these snakes, and it's because they didn't agree with him. And they did very much agree with his successor. So it's just a simple matter of removing the problem and It had all been arranged in advance with cover stories and patsies and rigged investigations afterwards, controlled by the new king, right? And all the people that were involved in the conspiracy were involved in the cover up and the investigation and everything afterwards, so that no one involved in the conspiracy ever paid any kind of a price at all. I mean, down to and including even the Secret Service agents who were guilty of all kinds of indiscretions didn't even get reprimanded. They got promoted. And the foxes who ate all the chickens in the hen house are now put in charge of the investigation afterwards. Alan Dulles, J. Edgar Hoover, LBJ. I mean, it's unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. So uh, I think what Prouty is saying, and I agree with very much, is that you can't accomplish what was accomplished in Dallas, if you want to call it an accomplishment, without the complicity of the Secret Service. It takes that. That's one of the necessary components. Just like LBJ was so crucial for the after for the immunization afterwards. So too is the Secret Service necessary just to get close to him to be able to carry out such a plot. I mean, you just take one little detail, for example. If William Greer, the driver, does what he's supposed to, then President Kennedy survives because all subsequent shots that hit him afterwards, none of them would have hit him. He survived that first shot, but he just hit the brakes, he stops, and he waits. And there's literally no one to protect Kennedy. The guy in the passenger seat supposed to jump on top, never moved. I mean, I don't want to relitigate all this, but you see my point. It takes the complicity of the Secret Service. So that's the answer to question 6. How would a conspiracy of the Secret Service even work? You just get those rogue operators at the top, all the decisions flow from them. And then afterwards, those guys cover for all the operators on the ground when they testify in the Warren Commission. And they withhold evidence, they manufacture evidence, they suppress evidence, they clean, they destroy evidence. And in the aftermath, they walk away scot-free. And everybody who was involved gets a promotion, including the 3 rogue operators. Unbelievable. All right, that brings us to 7. Question number 7. What is a limited hangout? Just recently, a book came out by Paul Landis. He was a Secret Service agent on the ground in Dallas that day. This is 60 years after the fact. So I think it was 2022 this book came out. So about 60 years exactly. And actually it's 2023. And in this book, some new information was released by Paul Landis. Now, here's Paul Landis. He was very close to Jackie. So you see a very young looking Paul Landis here on top left, where Jackie's behind him. Here he is, top right, pictured next to Jackie. And then on in the motorcade itself, you see he's right behind Clint Hill. He's circled in red there. You see how young he is. So he's on that running board right behind Clint Hill. He was detailed to Jackie, just like Clint Hill was. So here he is, 88 years old, former Secret Service agent, writing a book, publishing a book, 2023, with some, a lot of people thought it was explosive information. He said, here he is writing on the right rear running board of the car nicknamed the Queen Mary. This is the follow-up car. And so he's right there. I mean, whatever he has to say, you're talking about a guy who was on the ground that day. So this is not a Secret Service agent back in DC. This is one of the inexperienced guys that replaced the experienced guy. He was there. He was one of the offending Secret Service agents. He acknowledges this, who was out all night. And according to him, they were drinking white lightnings all night at the cellar. And according to him, they left at 5 a.m. and arrived to work at 8 a.m. on November 22, and they were hung over. This is his testimony. So this corroborates what uh, came out right after the newspaper. I forget the reporter who wrote about it. Uh, he's the one that kind of got the ball rolling on the investigation, but Landis is corroborating the story. He said that after 6 months, 6 months after the assassination, he continued for those 6 months working on the Jackie Kennedy detail, but then he quit 6 months later. He said it was because of PTSD. He just couldn't take it anymore. So from there, he went into real estate. He became a professional hand model, which I don't know what the hell that is. A film production company owner, and then he owned a machine shop. He was a house painter for a while. He was a handyman. He was a security guard in a museum. In other words, he just sort of dibbled and dabbled after his brief Secret Service stint as one of Jackie's agents. And in 2023, he needed money. And simultaneous to that, the deep state needed a new narrative about the JFK assassination because enough new evidence had emerged by the time we get to 2023 that their original narrative, their original story, no longer was credible. There's so many aspects of it that were so incredible by the time we got to 2023 that in order for the CIA or the deep state's narrative to have any credibility going forward, they were going to have to move on some of their points that they had hung on to for so long. They were going to have to adapt. Otherwise, their story, they would no longer be credible. This is what a limited hangout is. Now I'll define it for you here in a minute, but the timing of this book was suspect. A guy like me is very suspicious of anyone on the inside coming out with details afterwards, 60 years afterwards. I am very suspicious, and I've just learned to be this way, very cynical of the inside operators coming out decades later with their version of events. I just pretty quickly, they almost have to convince me. The burden of proof is on them to convince me that they are not being used by the folks they used to work for, or maybe still work for, to uh, add to the narrative or change the narrative, but always to the advantage, seemingly, of the agency for whom they used to work. In this particular case, 2023 is the 60th anniversary. It's actually 2022. It's the 60th anniversary of the JFK assassination. And one thing you'll notice every time there's an anniversary, November 22 comes around, books get released, movies get released, especially on the decade, right? The 5th, the 30th, the 40th, the 50th, the 60th. It's become a cottage industry. And almost in every succeeding decade, the narrative has changed slightly because of new evidence. The old phony deep state narrative was that Oswald acted alone. That's what the Warren Commission said. There was no conspiracy. Oswald acted alone. They had all kinds of false information, provably false information in the Warren report, like Oswald and Ruby didn't know each other, that uh, there was no mafia connection to Ruby. I mean, these are provably false, right? So now they need a new deep state narrative. Otherwise, they lose all their credibility. So now the new narrative is that Oswald acted as part of a conspiracy. I mean, the government itself had a new narrative by the time we got to 78 with the House Select Committee. They didn't know how it happened, and they didn't want to get into how it happened, but they knew it was a conspiracy. We have two government reports. In 64, they said Oswald acted alone. By the time we get to 78, the government says, well, no, it was a conspiracy. So the government, even in its published its two investigations, doesn't agree with itself. So why do you need this new narrative? Because there's so much new evidence that Oswald was set up as a patsy, just as he said, by the real conspirators. There's so much new evidence that points to that, that continuing to say that he acted alone is flying in the face of evidence. And you stand to lose credibility with, especially as each succeeding generation comes along, they're calling bullshit on this old narrative. There's just too much evidence that says the opposite. And even our own government said there was a conspiracy in 78. So by the time we get to 2023, it's clear that a new narrative, uh, in order to preserve the credibility of the CIA and the Secret Service and the government itself, and the FBI and all these deep state operators, they need a new narrative. So the new claim, as ill, comes out in the form of this book. This is how they release it. They're not going to come out and make an announcement. The CIA director is not going to come out and make an announcement standing behind the CIA lectern, the CIA logo behind his head, saying, "Hey, we've changed our mind. This is how." The FBI director is not going to do that. Uh, Secretary of State's not going to. I mean, you're not going to see that as an official act by the government. It's going to come out. They're going to uh, feed it to the American people through books, through literature. They're going to drop a document here or there, and just slightly change the narrative, little bit by little bit by little bit, move a little bit in the direction that agrees with some of this new evidence, so it appears that they are still credible. So this new claim comes out. They have, we've already seen through Operation Mockingbird, they control most of the news media. They have a long roster of authors and people under their control, write the books. They pay them. I mean, they publish their books. They buy their books, so they become New York Times bestsellers, right? Well, they've got this guy. He needs money. He's one of them. And so he writes this new book and this explosive new claim. He says, well, I was with the motorcade when it got to Parkland, and I found a bullet lodged in the back seat where Kennedy had been sitting. He said he picked up the bullet, he put it in his pocket, and later he placed it on the president's gurney so that the evidence would stay with the body. And in his book, he says, quote, there was nobody there to secure the scene, and that was a big bother to me. This was all going on so quickly. And I was just afraid that it was a piece of evidence that I realized right away was very important, and I didn't want it to disappear or get lost. And so here he is, uh, claiming that he found a bullet that was lying in the back seat with the president, had been sitting. Now, this is 6 decades after the fact. He never came forward with this evidence in the immediate aftermath. He was called to testify, give statements, never said anything about a bullet that he found. He was, uh, one of the things that Raleigh did so successfully was to protect the cover-up, was to shield some of his agents from ever having to testify. He sort of filled in for them, and so as to protect them from, saying the wrong thing. So anyway, he never had to testify in front of the Warren Commission. Um, and one of the reasons the Warren Commission gave was that Landis really didn't have anything new new information to shed light on anything, because he indicated that, one of his statements was that he thought a shot came from the front. So this is one of the tricks that Allen Dulles and the Warren commissioners used, was they would look at what they thought this person might say, and then they would choose to call the people that would say what agreed with the narrative and choose not to call the people who might say what didn't agree with the narrative. In this particular case, they had indications that Landis was going to talk about a shot from the front, so they just didn't call him. And of course, Raleigh was the guy in charge who helped determine which agents got called and which agents didn't get called. Anyway, he's explaining his having quit the Secret Service. He says he was, quote, totally sleep deprived and suffering from severe PTSD after Dallas. And he says, that's why I forgot to tell everybody about the bullet. I was just, this PTSD messed with me, and I just forgot about it. The problem for the narrative is that the Landis bullet is the magic bullet upon which the Warren Commission's entire single bullet theory is based. All right. They say they found a bullet. Remember, wherever they found it, they said they found it at Parkland Hospital. And this was the magic bullet that went through two bodies and created like 7 or 8 different wounds, changed directions, changed trajectories, and fell out in almost perfect condition. And they said that they found this bullet on the stretcher. Well, according to Landis, he put that bullet on the stretcher. The Warren Commission, in their concoction of this fantasy, said, well, this bullet must have fallen out of one of the wounds while the body was rolling around on the stretcher. But Landis is saying, no, I put it on the stretcher. It was in my pocket, and I put it on the stretcher. Oh, this is a problem. How could a bullet that didn't go through JFK's body, and as evidenced by the fact that it was sitting in the seat, all right? So clearly it didn't go through the president's body, because Landis, if he is to believe, said he found it in the back seat. So this is the same bullet that they're claiming went through the president, hit him in the back, came out his neck, made a right-hand turn midair, went towards the front seat and hit Connolly in the right armpit. The back of the right armpit came out the front of the right armpit, hit him in the right wrist, which was propped up on the door, went in, went out, and did a somersault in midair, embedded itself deep in his thigh. And they're saying that somewhere in the hustle and bustle of Parkland Hospital on these stretchers, that bullet fell out of Connolly's thigh onto the stretcher, and they found it. And of course, it's this pristine bullet. It's in perfect condition. Nobody believes that bullet could cause all that damage, go through, hit those bones and things, and not be damaged. You got that problem. But now you have a second problem. The second problem is that one of their own is saying that thing didn't fall out of anybody's thigh. It was in the seat. I picked it up, put it in my pocket, and then eventually put it on the stretcher. So that's how it got on the stretcher. So the obvious conclusion is that the Landis revelation destroys the whole single bullet theory. It couldn't have happened. Not the way the Warren Commission said it happened. You say, well, how is that advantageous to the deep state? Well, remember now, by the time we get to 2023, nobody believes the single bullet theory. It has been debunked so many different ways, in addition to the way Paul Landis just debunked it, that it's laughable. If people bring it, I mean, I was watching Seinfeld the other night, and they did a whole mock-up of the single bullet theory. And it's become, there's nothing worse than ridicule of someone or something's position. It's people can come out and oppose things, people can come out and argue against things, and it still maintains some level of credibility. When you've lost all credibility is when people mock it and ridicule it. And by the time we get to 2023, this single bullet theory has become the magic bullet theory. And it's the object of ridicule. Comedians make fun of it. If a researcher brings it up in the context of it being credible, I know, and many people of my ilk know, that person is not to even be taken serious. It's like the lone nut. If someone comes out and argues and says that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. If I watch a movie, last night, my wife, we had been advised by people, you should watch 11/22/63. It's this thing based on Stephen King's novel. And as we get into episode 6, 7, 8, it's starting to morph towards a lone gunman. I can't even watch the thing. It's just laughable. Because there's so much evidence that points to a conspiracy. There's literally no evidence that points to a lone gunman. None that I can think of that's credible. It doesn't stand the test of time. The ballistics doesn't line up. The witness testimony doesn't match it. The physical evidence doesn't match it. Nothing. So it's become laughable. It's become a joke. Just like the single bullet theory had become the magic bullet theory, become a joke. So the deep state's conclusion was, okay, all right, our original narrative has fallen apart. It doesn't pass muster anymore. So we need to uh, uh, adapt. But we don't need these researchers. We don't need uh, uh, the outside, the outsiders, these conspiracy theorists, people setting the narrative. We need to set the narrative. So we're going to do that through one of our own by carrying out what's called a limited hangout. We're going to uh, uh, change the narrative slightly, but we get to control it. We get to control what the new narrative is. We just like we set the original narrative. Um, the reason I believe this is a limited hangout is because who's behind it? James, obviously, we've already said spoke the motive. The guy needed money, okay, and the deep state needs a new narrative. So you have this bringing together of motives where the deep state needs a new narrative. This guy needs money. He's one of them. So uh, he'll do their bidding. He's been doing their bidding for 60 years by not speaking the truth. He said PTSD or something. James Robenall, pictured here, is a lawyer, author, contributor to the Daily Beast. He was a partner to John Dean, went around the country giving Watergate lectures. If you know anything about John Dean, you know that he was one of these Watergate conspirators that participated in a deep state setup of Richard Nixon. The guy was a flat out liar. And Robenall was his partner. Went around the country giving all kinds of speeches. I give several, I talk about John Dee in my Watergate series. And he was used and willingly used uh, to help set up Richard Nixon. Anyway, this guy Robenall, because of his connection to Watergate, Dean, uh, is one of these unaccountable, unelected deep state figures that a lot of us don't even know about. He's got, as a lawyer, he had clients that included Pratt and Whitney aircraft engines. Remember, the deep state is the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. So he's representing, like Alan Dulles used to, like John Foster Dulles used to, these armaments industries. In this case, it's Pratt and Whitney aircraft engines and Mission Essential. It's the name of the company. These are government contractors that serve intelligence and military clients. This is their lawyer. And in addition to being a lawyer to this deep state entity, this national security apparatus, he's a partner of John Dean. And if you have studied anything about Watergate, you know John Dean is one of the bad guys. So this guy, by extension, is one of the bad guys. And we find out that he is the real author of Landis's memoir. Landis was 88 years old when this came out. And he partnered. You look at the cover of the book, and his co-author is James Robenall. And James Robenall essentially became his agent. According to Amazon Publishing, Robenall helped Landis, quote, process his memories. In other words, Robenall was the ghostwriter of this book. Landis, to this day, and he's an old man, so you can understand he doesn't give interviews. if there's anyone who interviews or wants to interview Landis about his book, he has to go through Robanal. And Robanal is the front man. He's become essentially his handler representing him. He handles all the interviews, and Landis has recently died. So this book, which is one of the most recent books on this topic, gets a lot of attention. And Robanal, because he's the co-author, because Landis is dead now, even when it came out, Landis was too old to give interviews. Robanal does all the talking. So Robanal did all the writing, and he does all the talking. It's essentially Robanal's book. He is the deep state operator that was chosen as the vehicle by which the deep state would change its narrative. But they needed a guy, a front man, who could be the author of the book, the picture on the cover, so that the American people would believe, so the media would believe, or whatever. There'd be credibility that this guy knew what he's talking about because he was one of the Secret Service agents on the ground that day. In other words, Robanal was he's the author of this book. And when you look at his connections, starting with Dean and the Watergate stuff, and then who he's representing as a lawyer, and what Amazon Publishing says about how he's the guy who processed Landis's memories for him. What does that mean? Processed his memories, helped him remember. You know, basically putting words probably in Landis's mouth. Landis is so desperate for money by this time. He's on his way out. What does he care? Right. And then subsequently, Landis does all the marketing, all the interviews, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, there's a lot of smoke here that this is a deep state plot to change the narrative. They just use Landis to be the front man. But the guy behind the scenes, ghostwriting, doing all the speaking, is this deep state operator. Couple problems that I have with the book. Okay, with these recent revelations. In 2013, so 10 years before this book came out, Gary Laux reported that Sam Kinney, remember he's in the car behind, the Secret Service driver of the Queen Mary, claimed that before he died, he found the bullet and placed it on the stretcher. Kinney died in 97. Laux died in 23, ironically, the same year this book came out. So we have a dispute here about who found the bullet. Kinney says he found it. And now you've got this guy, Landis, saying that he found it. And, Kinney says all the way back in 13 that he found it. So, in other words, in 2023, this revelation has been out there for a decade already before Landis gloms onto it or Robanal gloms onto it and says it was Landis, whichever. The other problem is that no law enforcement officer would drop evidence on a stretcher. That violates everything, all their training, because chain of custody for evidence is absolutely crucial. You keep it, you put it in a baggie, and you turn it in so that the chain of evidence went from you finding it, you securing it, to the time that you turn it in, so there'd be a chain of custody of this evidence that it can be used in a court of law. Otherwise, you just throw it on a stretcher. It could be swapped out. It could fall on the ground. Somebody else step on. You have to secure the evidence. That's the first rule in law enforcement. So no law enforcement, it's not even believable what he did. The claim itself is not believable. And then when you add into the fact that Sam Kinney has already claimed that he's the one who found the bullet and placed it on the stretcher. So now you get into an argument about who really found it. Did Sam Kinney find it? Did Landis find it? They both said they placed it on the stretcher. So we know the magic bullet theory is shot to hell. But now chain of custody is a problem. The violation of protocol, you just throw it on a stretcher. I mean, there's so many problems with this story. What is a limited hangout? A limited hangout is jargon for it's an intelligence term. It's a gimmick that intelligence uses to this is the definition from Wikipedia. Okay. It's spy jargon for a favorite and frequently used gimmick of the clandestine professionals. When their veil of secrecy is shredded and they can no longer rely on a phony cover story to misinform the public, they resort to admitting, sometimes even volunteering, some of the truth while still managing to withhold the key and damaging facts of the case. The public, however, is usually so intrigued by the new information that it never thinks to pursue the matter further. So a limited hangout is when you realize, oh my God, our story's falling apart. It's people are laughing at it now. The veil of secrecy has been shredded. This phony cover story that we've used to misinform the public all this time is blown to hell. And in this case, it's the magic bullet theory, the single bullet theory. So we've got to admit or volunteer something. We got to give something to the public to divert their attention away from the real truth. What would cause the American people to get all caught up in a tizzy? I know. Let's say that we found a bullet, and that proves that there was no single bullet. The single bullet theory, it disproves the single bullet theory, upon which the entire Warren Commission conclusion is based. Now, it doesn't mean that there was a conspiracy necessarily. It doesn't mean that Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't involved. It doesn't mean that we're admitting to anything other than the fact that the single bullet didn't happen the way we said it happened. And that admission will get the American people and the research community and the media so stirred up that this single bullet theory is being admitted by the very deep state operators who came up with it to be false. They'll get so caught up in that they won't pursue, okay, if that's not true, what does that mean? What could flow from that, since that is no longer true? And that'll buy us another 3 or 4 decades. That's what a limited hangout is. Dribble out little dribs and drabs of information that contradict the narrative once they become discredited. And the people jump onto those things. And we fell for it. I saw how many interviews, how many newspaper headlines, how many how many internet articles about this new information about the single bullet. And it wasn't about the conspiracy and how this disproves the single gunman. It was all about the single bullet, the magic bullet theory. His book's called The Final Witness. What does it accomplish? This new information shapes this modified limited hangout position. Even if the information itself is suspect. I mean, we've already seen the information is suspect because Sam Kinney claimed to have found it 10 years earlier. And now you got James Landis saying he found it. So the information is suspect. That it's not believable because no police officer would handle evidence that way. No law enforcement officer. So the fact that the information itself is incredible, spurious to say the least. And then the fact that Landis got this big publishing contract at a time when he needed money. And the guy behind this book is clearly a deep state operator. He is so in thick, like in deep with the deep state. You can't believe it's like asking Alan Dulles. It's like you're taking a statement from Alan Dulles all over again or something. You can't believe anything these people say. There's always a reason, there's always a motive. They just used Landis for their limited hangout to change the direction, the narrative a little bit, and divert attention away from the real truth, which is, I think they're afraid that evidence is compounding now quicker and quicker, and we're getting closer and closer to the truth faster and faster. And so, in order to keep up and stay in control of the narrative to the extent that they can, they they use these limited hangouts, and sometimes it comes about in the form of a new document. Sometimes it comes out in the form of a movie or a book or a new witness who just miraculously appears. In this case, it's one of their own in a book, but it's ghost written by one of their own, and it's an admission that the single bullet theory is trash, has always been trash. But that admission alone, because they hung on to it for so long, was so newsworthy. It diverted the American people's attention away from what the consequences or uh, what the fact the how this relates to the overall conspiracy. Hopefully, I'm explaining this well. I just am very dubious of these deep state operators who come out 6 decades later with new information that gets the American people all stirred up, because it's just like the original cover story. The original cover story was dropped on the American people by these same deep state operators. And it got the American people all stirred up and convinced that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Why? As I mentioned earlier, it was a psyop. It was designed to fill the vacuum. American people were confused. They were angry. They were upset. They wanted vengeance. They wanted justice. Uh, all these things. They wanted answers. And here comes this cover story. It gives them answers that they can believe in. It makes sense. Now, they couldn't afford to have a trial because any competent defense attorney would have tore the evidence apart, and no court would have convicted Lee Harvey Oswald. They knew it. They couldn't afford to have a trial. Who knows what gets said on the stand in a trial? So they killed him. And it just became, now he has no one to defend him. Can't defend himself in front of the Warren Commission, in front of the court of public opinion. He can't defend himself. He's dead and gone. And so that becomes the narrative. That's what's in the history books. That's what's in the movies. That's what's in the books. That's what's in culture. It just becomes accepted. And then the researchers come along. They start chipping away, chipping away, chipping away, chipping away. They get documents released. A movie comes out. This, that, and after 6 decades, the narrative is so laughably impossible that even the deep state has to acknowledge, okay, it's no longer believable. People are ridiculing it. So how can we change it slightly so as still to protect the overall narrative, which is that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, but change little details within the narrative that will get the American people so stirred up they'll chase the the shiny nickel. They'll focus on the shiny nickel instead of what's behind it, the real truth. It's a psyop. It's a strategy to delay, delay, delay. And of course, you heard that expression, justice delayed is justice denied. And that's the whole point. I mentioned the House Select Committee in 1978. Uh, this decided that JFK died as a result of conspiracy. Uh, that's because of the new evidence that came out in that 15 years since the assassination. But other new evidence came out, primarily Abraham Bolden. And it implicated the Secret Service much more by the point in time we get to 1978 than the Warren Commission did in 1964. And they concluded, quote, the Secret Service was deficient in the performance of its duties. The Secret Service possessed information. It was not properly analyzed, investigated, or used in connection with the president's trip to Dallas. In other words, what they're saying is they knew they possessed information that that president's life was in danger. By this time, they've learned of all these different plots and all these different places. They've learned about Chicago. They've learned about Tampa. They've learned about Miami. All the stuff that was hidden from them in '64. Now they know. And so they're saying they're answering our question. One of our questions was, did the Secret Service have advance notice? According to House Select Committee, yes, they did. They possessed information, and they didn't analyze it. They didn't investigate it. They didn't use it in connection with the president's trip to Dallas. They just ignored it. The Secret Service agents in the motorcade were inadequately prepared to protect the president from a sniper. In this particular case, the president was hit. Now, he could have been protected after the first hit, but he was hit by a shot from a sniper that, the Secret Service agents on the ground could not have probably prevented. In other words, that is a deficiency in their protocols. They need to take into account the fact that a sniper from long range could take out the president in the future. So that they failed to anticipate that a president could be shot by a sniper. And then lastly, no actions were taken by the agent in the right front seat of the presidential limo to cover the president. I, for the life of me, can't figure out why they distinguish from the agent in the right front seat from the agent in the left front seat, the driver. And nevertheless, they did. And they said that he was, it was a dereliction of duty, obviously. So what my point is, by 1978, this is how far we had come because of new evidence that had been uncovered in 15 years. Whereas in 1964, the Secret Service was largely absolved. By the time we get to 78, it's no longer being absolved. There's just too much new evidence that come out. And that's what I'm saying. When time moves on, new evidence comes out. Eventually, truth does sort of worm its way to the surface. And we're 6 decades plus removed. And so a lot of new evidence has come out, which has made it necessary for these deep state apologists, these lone gunman apologists, to move off their original narrative in the direction of where. And what's interesting, all the evidence that comes out, none of it supports the original narrative. All the new evidence supports the conspiracy, because and I think that's really important, because what's that old saying? A lie goes around the world 7 times before the truth gets out of town. It takes a while for the truth to catch up. The original, or first story, is almost always the lie. It's the quickest, it's the easiest. If you ever played that game where you get in a circle with people and you whisper something in somebody's ear, then they turn whisper it to the next person, they turn whisper. By the time it comes back around, the story's completely changed. Everybody puts their spin on it, right? The lie goes around the world faster than the truth. So here we are, 6 decades plus removed, and the truth that has wormed its way to the surface, all of this new evidence supports conspiracy. So there's never in this push and pull between the truth and the lie, there's never any evidence that supports the lie. That's the original narrative. And for the last 60 years, the original narrative has been in a defensive crouch trying to protect its position, but finding it increasingly hard to do so because all the new evidence supports the other side. And so there's been this pulling along, and even those people that believe the lone gunman, even the Warren Commission, the Warren Report, by the time you get 6 decades removed, it's so far off the original narrative, it's no longer credible. And if you're going to remain credible, you have to adapt with the times, with the evidence, and try to put your spin on it so it still somehow protects the original narrative to the extent that you can. It's just like someone telling a lie and trying to protect that lie. What they do, and I learned this as a little kid, lying is hard because it forces you to remember the lie. And If you're really invested in that lie, then you concoct another lie to support the original lie. And then when it becomes apparent that that lie is no longer going to work, you come up with another one and another one and another one. And eventually what you have is a house of cards that can't support its own weight. It's just lie upon lie upon lie upon lie. And that's what the lone gunman narrative has become. And even the deep state, their operators have to acknowledge the fact that their lies no longer pass the smell test. And so they come up with tactics like the limited hangout strategy. And it almost always works because it stirs up the American people. It gets us all foaming at the mouth about the new information, and we forget the bigger picture, but not forever, just in that moment, and it buys them some more time. Anyway, going back to Prouty again, uh, he gave a speech and he was talking. He says, "What is it that keeps the king alive? In every country, the king would not live if there was not an elite guard. He just has too many enemies. When you control the elite guard of a country, you control the fate of the king. The elite guard will protect the life of the king as long as it agrees with the king. What keeps the king alive or not is the elite guard." And it's his contention and mine that the Secret Service, which was our elite guard, still is, was controlled, in this case, by rogue operators who were connected to this deep state. And so, in essence, the deep state, through its proxy, these rogue operators in the Secret Service, were controlling the fate of JFK. And they didn't agree with the king. They didn't agree with JFK. And so a decision was made uh, to lay down on the job, to security strip, um, because they wanted him replaced. So what keeps the king alive or not is elite guard. In our case, what keeps the president alive or not is the Secret Service. And so if the president is alive, he owes his life to the Secret Service. But if the president dies, it's because the Secret Service allowed it to happen. And that's what I believe happened. And that's why the Secret Service was so necessary to this plot. Um, okay, we've this that concludes the series on the Secret Service, and we'll be moving on to the next deep state operator from here. But wanted just to quick note some of the sources that I used or that you could access if you want to learn more about this. Vince Palomera is, as I mentioned earlier, is so-called the Secret Service expert in the research community. So he's got a number of books here you could check out. Um, he's also on YouTube. You can hear him speak. Fletcher Prouty, as I've noted. Um, Abraham Bolden's book, The Echo from Dealey Plaza. Uh, and of course, for just matters of information and documents and stuff, you can get the House Select Committee final report, the Warren report. Also, the JFK movie does a pretty good job anecdotally of telling the Secret Service story, especially with respect to the breakdowns. And there's a episode on the Men Who Killed Kennedy series. It's a good source. James Eugenio, who is he's widely respected JFK researcher, has written a book called JFK Revisited. Um, there's a couple other books, Destiny Betrayed. Oliver Stone has become a good source on this. He's really dived deep into the JFK assassination. Uh, he dipped his toe in the water with JFK movie and then got so much blowback from that. He's done documentaries and other things since then. Uh, it's become like a life's work for him. So those are some of the sources, and there are others. But those are some that I would recommend myself. So anyway, that concludes the part of the Secret Service. And remember, today's two questions were how would a conspiracy involving the Secret Service even work? And that would be the rogue operators, the three names I gave you, James Rowley, Thomas Kelly, and Emory Roberts. Then the seventh question was, what is a limited hangout? And a limited hangout is when the deep state uh, releases information that because their original narrative has become so discredited as a result of new evidence that they can no longer, with a straight face, claim the original narrative. So they have to release information. They try to do it little bit by little bit so as to hang on to the larger lie while admitting the smaller truth, and trying to hang on to that larger lie as long as possible. And it's purposely meant to divert attention away from the larger truth by getting the American people all stirred up in these small little concessions. That's a limited hangout. And that's what I believe this book by Paul Landis, was intended to do. It was ghost written by a deep state operator with the intention of revealing new information that would discredit the single bullet theory and create this new limited hangout that they could hang on to for the next couple decades or so. But anyway, that's enough for today. Thanks for hanging in there with me. I know today ended up being a little bit longer. We covered 2 episodes in one today. And until next time, God bless. Thank you.